Let's just take a look at where they are located. This is the density in where they are located. Sometimes you wonder why they're not everywhere. Why are there some regions that seem to be empty? And it's simply because if the culture in that region does not develop language and writing capacity as quickly, or there isn't the kind of civilization density in certain regions, you don't see the stories. But anywhere in which you see people grouping and civilization rising, you're going to find a flood story. Isn't that interesting? And looking at the flood stories you find certain characteristics, certain features are repeated. So for example, in these stories, 88% contain the story of a favored family who was warned in advance, in 66% of these, of a universal flood. Now,
in today's video, we're going to be taking a good look at a conference that J.J. Warner Wallace was at. Now, he is a Christian apologist. He's written the book Cold Case Christianity. He was a detective who applied the methods of investigation and detective work to Christianity and became convinced. Today, he's going to be talking about the flood story that's found in Scripture. Now, prior to me becoming a Christian, I read in even the Hindu mythology about a global flood. You know, there was a story of a global flood that took place, and Manu and his family survived by, a giant fish. However, if you look all over the world, there's over 160 cultures that have a global flood story. But here's the thing. What makes the biblical flood story the most accurate and the truest account of what actually took place? In this video, we're going to be taking a good look at the evidence that J.J. Warner Wallace presents that really unpacks and shows us why the biblical story can be trusted. Let's get back to this video.
Best classic Renaissance art of this event doesn't really help our cause. So typically you'll see pictures like this, right? You've got the ark there, and the water looks good, the boat looks big enough. But then I got like elephants and giraffes kind of hanging over the edge like tourists, hey, look at all that water. And even some of the best artwork on this, it doesn't help our cause. It makes us look like this is really what happened. Whatever happened, I don't know, but maybe I don't think it probably looked like this. I could be wrong, it might have looked like this, but maybe not. But why do we always draw like we're narrating some kid's book, right? Well, it turns out that there are a number of ancient stories about a flood across the globe. Nearly every civilization that's ever lived has got some narrative from the ancient past involving a flood. Did you know that? There are over 200 that we've collected so far, ancient accounts about a flood that occurred in the ancient past. And if you look at where they are located on the map, it's pretty interesting. Of course, you'd expect to see some around the Mediterranean, right? Because let's face it, Moses' account comes from there. So let's take a look at that area of the world. It turns out, though, that Moses' account's not the only one. There are ancient accounts in the area of Egypt, Persia, Turkey, Middle East. There are many ancient accounts of a flood. And if you go into Europe and look a little closer at some of the ancient stories from European cultures in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Belgium, in Spain, in Italy, you will find other versions of a flood. And if you go out all the way into China and the areas of Siberia, you'll find that there are also accounts in Thailand, India, of an ancient catastrophic flood. Or if you move down into Australia, that's kind of far away, don't you think? But there are accounts here of ancient floods in many regions in Australia and in New Zealand, and even in the Pacific Islands. If you go into areas around Tahiti, Fiji, Hawaii, you will see a number of ancient accounts of floods even in the South Pacific. How about in our continent, in the area of Alaska or the Americas? You'll see throughout Canada, throughout regions of America in which there are tribal Indian stories that still survive. You'll see them in the area of Washington State, in the area of Tennessee, Georgia. You will see a number of these ancient accounts of a global flood. And of course, Central America, similar in the area of Guatemala, Nicaragua, and throughout the entire area in South America, all the way to the southern tip of Argentina, you will find accounts of an ancient global flood. Now, to be fair, years ago when I first started looking at this, I read through all these accounts, and some of them are kind of dry, okay? And they really don't all contain every element of the flood that Moses contains in his story with Noah. They just don't. But there are some striking similarities. Universal, I don't mean the entire universe was filled with water. I mean universally catastrophic. Now, sometimes people, even Christians, will divide on whether they think the flood was global or local. And if it's local, they would still agree it's a universally catastrophic flood. It's just maybe not the entire earth. That's an argument for a different day. I'm not sure where some of you land on that issue. But I'm talking about the entire breadth of stories from antiquity. The idea that a catastrophic flood that kills everything is in 95% of them. The survivors in 70% use a boat, and they save animals in 67%, and at 57%, they end up on top of a mountain. Look at the story. If I didn't tell you what that story was, I just kind of gave you these details, what would you think I was describing? you'd think I was describing Noah. And it turns out that's a very similar features. There are some similar features in all of these stories. And if we needed any more proof that maybe there was some kind of an event, some kind of a flood event, a lot of geologists, and Christian and otherwise, have started looking at the way that, what would you expect if there was a flood event? The stones speak, not like this, but they speak like this. If you had a global flood event, you would have, even if it's a major flood event that's not global, you're going to see features of the ground as the water rises, stratify, it ruins certain features, creates certain levels that then when the earth moves and mountains are formed, these levels would be available to us to see afterwards. This is what we would expect if this was a global flood, and it turns out that we do see features like this all around the globe. So I think there's probably some good reason, if I'm making a bet here, I'm betting there was some kind of flood event in the ancient past. But the question becomes, how do I know it's the version that Moses is recording? Why should I trust Moses' version, especially if there are other ancient versions out there?
Absolutely. There are lots of ancient claims about a special family that was isolated in a boat that saved animals for a future generation during a great flood. We've got great flood stories all over the planet. It's really interesting, separated by continents. And there are some that you could argue predate the writing of the Old Testament. But remember, what Moses is writing about when he chronicles Genesis, right? He's writing about events that occurred in the ancient past. Moses wasn't there, for example, during Genesis 1 to see God create everything. He's writing about an event that precedes him by lots and lots of years. And as a matter of fact, all those events in Genesis precede him by lots and lots of years. So to say, well, okay, I've got a Babylonian flood event, a flood narrative that dates 500 to 1,000 years prior to the Old Testament book of Genesis makes no sense, because both of these narratives are reporting something that occurred before both of them. So what you have is just the Babylonian event being recorded, the Babylonian record, and and Moses' record. I don't care where you put them; both of them are recording something that happened way before. Now, what's interesting about that is that actually adds more validity, because here you have a hostile culture recording something not identical, but pretty close to what Moses records. They both seem to be capturing some truth about an event that preceded both of these cultures. The day of Noah preceded the Babylonians. The day of Noah preceded Moses. Both are writing in their own time about a real event that occurred in history. And we have two different accounts. It doesn't matter to me which one comes first. What matters to me is, did that first account occur? So when I see that we have 2 accounts, or 3 accounts, or 10 accounts, and if you look at the different global flood accounts, we have a ton, they're all pointing to something that precedes all of those accounts, something that really happened in the ancient past. And so that really never gave me any fits as a cold case detective trying to figure out, because I also was right away investigating all the claims of the Old Testament. I discovered some of these ancient accounts, but remember, both accounts are recording an event that occurred long before either of them.
And the point is that the event actually occurred, which by most people reporting on it proves that it did.
Right. So what you either argue is that Moses somehow borrows from the Babylonian account. That's kind of what the history teachers are probably going to try to assess. But remember, we'll work cold cases where I'll find a witness who was recorded in 1980 about an event that happened in 1979. And then many years go by. Now it's 2016, and I do some digging, and I find somebody who says, I was there too. I saw it too. Well, did you tell anybody? Well, nobody asked. Okay, so now I've got a record, an eyewitness record from 2016. Am I going to argue, well, no, you're just borrowing from that 1980 record? No, I'm not. I don't even know that guy. I just know of the event because I saw the event that happened prior to both of us. So now here you have the same kind of thing. An event that occurs first in 1979, a record from 1980, and a record from 2016. 2016 record is not borrowing from the 1980 record. They're both recording their independent recollections about what occurred prior. And so we have to decide between those two what's true. Doesn't mean that either one is 100% true, and my 1980 guy might be slightly off on certain events or not have seen everything, and my 2016 person might be slightly off. I've got to kind of reconcile those two records to see what do I think really happened in 1979.
That was a really eye-opening presentation that J.J. Warner Wallace did on the flood story and what is common with other flood stories, and then what's specifically unique to the biblical flood story. It's fascinating. The Bible is far different in its account of the flood story than any other flood story that exists. Now, there are older flood accounts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumerian tablets, but here's the thing. Just because it's older doesn't make it accurate. In fact, all the other flood stories that exist globally include a lot of mythos language. There's a lot of symbolism, things like, all sorts of unusual, fanciful explanations. But when you're studying out the biblical account, It's a real person in a real location. There are real locations mentioned, a real experience. There's real consequences. There's real information. The other thing is this, is that well before paleontology became a science, we have the story of the flood. In other words, well before we began to go deep into the ground to explore what was there in the fossil records, we have this biblical account of a global catastrophe that flooded the world and buried creation, fallen creation. So we would expect from the biblical account that these things would exist. And that was prior to paleontology. The other thing I think that is really important in regards to the flood story is that Jesus himself affirmed a literal, a global flood story. And he affirmed the existence of Noah. And I think it's really important that we can believe the things that Jesus believed. And if Jesus affirmed and believed this, then so can we. Friends, thank you so much for watching this exciting video. Please continue to like and subscribe for more exciting content.